Well, I just want to thank you all for allowing me the opportunity to be here with you today. I studied at the University of Essex 7 years ago, and when I was here living in the UK, I had an opportunity to meet with Ben Rogers when he was actually starting up CSW's branch in the US, and to tell me about that initiative. So it's been a pretty long journey for those 7 years to come full circle back here, and really it's just an honor for me. When I was at Essex, interestingly enough, I was studying under Kevin Boyle, who's passed away since, but he was a scholar on religious liberty, and he had me do a study of the International Religious Freedom Act from the United States, which is a U.S. policy that established religious freedom as a dominant part of our foreign policy. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute, but he had asked me to assess the U.S. policy on IRFA, as we like to call it for short, the International Religious Freedom Act. And so today I'm going to actually talk a little bit about that. I don't feel like my assessment then is quite as strong as it is today, so you have the benefit of 7 years of my experience working for the U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom, which was a government agency established under IRFA, and then Capitol Hill, and now the Becket Fund. The Becket Fund is a law firm. It's a nonprofit law firm, and they defend the free expression of people of all faiths. So in my work on Capitol Hill and at the Becket Fund, and in much of what CSW does, I've had the opportunity to help all people have the freedom of religious expression. And in doing that, I found that as a Christian defending a lot of people, you have a lot of credibility when you travel around the world, because you're not just standing up for your own faith, but you're standing up for the faith of all people to seek truth. And ultimately, we believe what that truth is. And so we would hope that everybody would be free to search for that truth freely. And CSW does that, and that's one of the reasons I've worked so closely with them over the years. So in the last year, I have had an experience with persecuted Christians in a way that I hadn't in the 7 years to a decade prior of my working on this issue. That has helped give me a broader perspective of the way religious persecution is trending in the world, and of understanding it a little bit more intimately with those that are being persecuted and affected by these trends. One of the things that I did is I had to take a step back, because working in the U.S., in Washington, D.C., with government officials, the ability to change things has gotten a little bit more difficult. I think it's actually gotten a little bit easier here in the UK, but in the US it had gotten a little bit more difficult. So I took a step back and I started studying the book of Daniel. And I'm sure, as you all know, Daniel had several visions about the really serious persecution that Christians would face throughout time. And he was very distraught by this. So he prayed and fasted for 3 weeks. And at the end of that time, an angel spoke to him and said, "It's going to get bad, but have patient endurance through it, and know that God is going to conquer and be victorious in the end." Amen. Thank you. And so as I give you this big picture, this kind of fishbowl overview of what religious persecution looks like around the world, specifically for Christians, I wanted to begin with that, because I think it's a good foundation for us to remember that it will get worse. It will affect not just those people that we're going to talk about today that face the most egregious persecution, but it will affect us here eventually. I mean, that's just a matter of time, and that's what the Bible has prophesied. So it is important for us here in a free country and in the free part of the world to stand up for those that are being egregiously persecuted, and to remember them, and to know that one day we may face that as well, or we may not. It might come in another generation's time, but that we are called as believers to have patient endurance and to stand up for those that are persecuted, and to have some kind of a hope for the future, to know that really, as the bishop had mentioned earlier, that God is in control and he will be victorious. So the International Religious Freedom Act, I'm going to begin there, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some other world trends. And I think that it's behind me. Perfect. So the International Religious Freedom Act, as I mentioned, was established in 1998. In 1997, I was studying in college, and there was a book by Paul Marshall, who some of you may know. He wrote, called Their Blood Cries Out, and it talked about the extensiveness of religious persecution for Christians around the world. It was grueling to read. And as a college student, I felt God calling me to begin working in this field, and so I did. Since 1998, there's been a number of positive developments that have happened as a result of this committed U.S. policy on religious freedom. One of which is that, at the beginning, is a recent effort that many people around the world have engaged in, so this isn't just U.S., but I'm just focusing on that for now, is this campaign to defend speech, religious speech in particular, against defamation resolutions at the United Nations. Now, the defamation resolutions were very dangerous because they were basically an effort to provide international legal cover for laws like the blasphemy and the apostasy laws that have put Pastor Nardakani in prison, Asia Bibi in Pakistan, and a number of other people in Egypt and elsewhere. So these were very dangerous laws. There was a large international effort, and I was a part of this from the beginning, so I can tell you that there was a major effort on part of a group of religious communities, not just Christians, to try to defeat these laws that affected Christians so badly and egregiously. That's one thing that the International Religious Freedom Act and U.S. policy was involved in. They achieved a number of prisoner releases. They achieved some educational changes in Saudi Arabia. They appointed a special envoy to work to create the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in the Sudan, which brought an end to the civil war there. They had a provision in their International Religious Freedom Act that would deny people that have persecuted individuals on the basis of their faith a visa to the United States. And so Narendra Modi, who I know that CSW is very involved in this as well, had been involved in the murder of, or allowing the murder of a number of Muslims of Hindus. I'm actually confusing it because it happened twice. Of Hindus in, I believe it was, in, am I right? Yeah, sorry, confusing it with another state in India. In Gujarat state in India, and so he was denied a visa to the U.S. That was the first time we used that provision of the International Religious Freedom Act, which was a really strong message to the government of India, which is a strong ally of the United States, that we're not going to stand up for that kind of persecution. So that was really significant. They addressed a problem in our immigration policy where people were being removed from the United States even though they had legitimate claims of religious persecution. It's called expedited removal. And then they also, something that I was involved in was that we were able to get several $1 million worth of funding to support programming overseas to positively train people in what religious freedom means in order to protect people that were being persecuted. So those were just some of the positive things. Now, that act passed in 1998, so we're looking 13 years on. And in 13 years, and the reason I began with this is because I want to give it as a model of how to address the other broader trends that we're going to deal with in a minute, is that there have been a number of challenges to U.S. policy. And so just going through those, we've seen that the definition of religious freedom has changed in those 13 years. So last year, the State Department was beginning to refer to religious freedom as freedom of worship, which is a very limited, it sounds like just a semantics thing. But in effect, when somebody is just protecting your freedom of worship, it's saying, well, you can worship, but that doesn't mean you can necessarily do it in public or with other people. It's a very limited version of what religious freedom means. And so we've seen this changing definition. We've also seen it at the State Department in the United States recently, where senior officials are saying that proselytism, the ability to share your faith, is inherently coercive and not protected by international human rights. This is a problem because as Christians, obviously, one of the greatest commission that we were given was to do what? Exactly. So if we can't do that because they don't consider it a human right, then we have a problem. And this isn't just something that people that are severely persecuted have a problem with. It's something that we as believers in the West have a problem with as well. There's been a changing definition of religious freedom in U.S. policy that's been very dangerous. We didn't have an ambassador for religious freedom for over 2.5 years. The Religious Freedom Office that was also established under the IRFA Act was demoted in its status within the State Department. So it basically, there's seven levels in the State Department, and it's at level 1. It almost got removed to the basement, but that will just give you kind of an idea of where religious freedom stands currently in our foreign policy. It's really not a top priority. In the past 13 years, where we've made this freedom a significant human right in our foreign policy, you would think that we would have a lot more movement. And in fact, we've seen decreasing coverage of religious freedom. It takes a lot to get it into the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or other papers, or for them to do it on the nightly news. It's not a priority. Other human rights issues have become more prioritized as time's gone by, and so we've seen trafficking and a number of other issues that are very important, but replace the prominence of religious freedom, which, as you know from American history, is a foundational human right there. There have been a number of attacks on religious freedom domestically. I won't get into those too much here, but there have been a number of inconsistent policies abroad that undermine our influence on religious freedom. This is typical with any foreign policy, as I'm sure the Baroness knows, but our support for Saudi Arabia, our dependence on foreign oil, our support of the Mubarak regime for 3+ decades has undermined our ability to say anything right now, and so you don't see the U.S. taking a lead and saying anything, and this is really unfortunate. So there's been a failure on the behalf of U.S. policy because of that. We've given foreign aid to Egypt for 3+ decades without any conditions on religious freedom. When I was working for one of the congressmen, we actually introduced a resolution to condition aid on the basis of religious freedom, and it didn't pass. Another provision passed that got Egypt a little bit to take this a little bit more seriously, but over time they began to wane again, unfortunately. The issue has never been institutionalized throughout our government, so we had this great foreign policy 13 years ago, but foreign service officers were never trained in it, and so our embassies have actually, unfortunately, not been protecting people of Christians and others that have been persecuted, but they turn them away. I've been involved in a number of cases where the government and our inability to understand religious freedom has actually harmed Christians in countries going to the U.S. embassies for help by allowing people that work in our embassies that are foreign nationals to report them to local police. So this has been a real problem. And then ultimately, if you go down to the bottom, one of the biggest problems is that over these 13 years, we followed a defensive and rather than an offensive approach. And I think this is probably one of the biggest failures of our foreign policy. And that ties into the next point, which is what are these larger trends and why haven't we been able to address them appropriately? So over the last few years, beginning in, I guess, 2007, with another book that Paul Marshall wrote, which was a study of religious freedom around the world. And in this report, he put on tiers, about 5 or 6 different tiers, all the countries in the world and their religious freedom, their level of religious persecution for everybody in the country. But I can tell you that I think it's about 75% of the people that are persecuted in the world are probably Christians. So you can keep that in mind as you look at these tiers on the scale. But Paul put together this tier of religious persecution, and I tallied up the countries, and about 2/3 of the world's population, if you looked at population from those countries, were in countries that severely persecuted people for their faith. And then keep in mind that 75% are probably Christians. That's a significant amount of Christians of the world's population that are persecuted every day, or that live in countries where there are severe restrictions on their ability to go to a house of worship such as this, meet publicly, choose their own religious leaders, a number of things that we think are so normal to us here in the West that for most people are life and death choices. So Paul did this book, he showed the series of tiers, and then back in 2009, there was a social scientist who many of us love, his name is Brian Grimm, who quantified this data in a report, which was the first of its kind, that showed that in fact Paul's theory was right, that 2/3 of the world's population do live in countries that severely persecute people. And so you can see the chart behind me. Now, people are persecuted either by government actions or by the hostile acts of private individuals that are given cover by governments. So there's 2 different ways that this occurs. I want to go over some of the findings of the study to just explain some of the trends and just explain how bad it really is. Now, some of the highest overall restrictions, if we look at the next one, are found in countries such as Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Iran. These are countries where government restrictions and social hostility kind of merge, so you have both going together.